Hi, guys. Hope you're having a great day wherever you are. We're at the end of another really long week, of news. And when I started Smarter News, the whole mission of Smarter News was and continues to be quick, concise, and nonpartisan information. But let's face it, a lot of our coverage recently hasn't been so quick and concise. And that's in part because we're covering a historic event, Russia's war on Ukraine. And sometimes you get these topics that demand a little bit more time invested to understand the different facets of this story. So we've done that. But I don't want to forget the other news that's out there. And I don't want to forget the mission of Smarter News. So today, what I decided to do is gather a few of the big stories that I really wanted to cover for this week for you. And I put them together in a little bit of a show, just so that I could give you a headline, a little context, and why it matters. Any number of these topics that are really on the sidelines of this larger story that we're watching in Ukraine would be front page news in any other news cycle. In fact, they could be. And this is part of the reason why I just want to put them on your radar so you know that they're out there, they're important, and we get a little bit of a foundation if the news cycle suddenly shifts, because we know that it will, and it does. And that's completely out of our control. So we're going to talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine, and then I'm going to take you around the world. We're also going to cover some domestic issues that are really important to all of us. So let's get started. Here's a headline that I think is really important. Poland has accepted more than 1 million people coming from Ukraine in the last 2 weeks. So think about that. Think about if Michigan accepted more than 1 million Canadians in the course of just under a 2-week period. That's a lot of people, and a lot of resources are going to support these refugees coming from Ukraine, and rightfully so. But we're still at the beginning of this story. And as this story continues, more people are flowing into places like Poland, and they also need support and resources. So this is a really important story to pay close attention to. Vice President Harris was in Poland this week, meeting with the president there about this very topic. And one of the things that's come up from the White House over the last 2 weeks, and it's becoming more repetitive from all sorts of sources related to this current administration, is just how long this war could last in Ukraine. So setting the expectations of the American public that we're going to be in this conflict, and this conflict is going to continue for a while. No timeline given, but just that it's not going to be short and over. And it's something that we should prepare ourselves for. Just think about that. The war in Afghanistan lasted 20 years, but we also have some examples of Russian wars and what happened during those times and how long they lasted. So let me give you an example. The first war that Russia waged on Chechnya, and I'm saying a recent war, so I'm looking at this particular period between 1994 and 1996, lasted about 2 years. So it was a more or less a 2-year operation at the time. The second Chechen war, when Vladimir Putin rose to power in office in Russia, happened in 1999. And the intensity of the fighting happened at the very beginning of the war, but the conflict lasted for years and years and years. And what you should know is that Grozny, the Chechen city that was really at the center of the war, was actually called the most destroyed city on the planet by the United Nations. We have some images of what it looked like over this time period. So as you're seeing on the news, this question of how far will Russia go? What about the tactics that Russia is using? I want you to have this point of context. This is recent history. This is partly under the rule of Vladimir Putin. And this is what happened when Russia waged war on a neighbor. Now, very different cultural dynamics at play here. However, this is an example. When you start seeing modern day images of Ukraine, you can see the similarities between them. So I think that historic context is really important. This idea of complete destruction, indiscriminate bombing isn't new. We have the historic context, so we don't need to wonder. This kind of wondering and the hypothetics that you're seeing a lot in the news, I want you to have this context. Speaking of the war on terror, and speaking of Afghanistan, one of the big headlines this week is that the Biden administration released a Gitmo detainee to Saudi Arabia. And a terrorism analyst I talked to frequently, I was asking, well, what about this guy that just got released? He's been held for a really long time. He's called the 20th hijacker because he attempted to come into the country in August 2001, and he was denied entry because he's suspicious. But according to a terrorism analyst that I talk to very frequently, if he had his way, he would have died a hijacker. Now, there's been all sorts of mental health issues that have been documented. And so what we learned this week from the Biden administration and the reporting around it is that they're releasing this particular detainee to Saudi Arabia for mental health care. Big picture. How many of the Gitmo detainees who have been released have returned to terror or are suspected to have returned to terror? There's a lot of different statistics that you could look at, but roughly 30% is the number that you often see most reported. So there's always that concern about those that have been held for so long when they're returned to whatever country they go back to, if they will also return to terrorist activities. One of the headlines that you may have missed related to Al-Qaeda, because we haven't talked a lot about Al-Qaeda recently, is that the US actually targeted an Al-Qaeda branch in Africa for the first time in 7 months. This is Al-Shabaab, again, a branch of Al-Qaeda, mainly operates in the area of Somalia and the surrounding area around there. We've had a very active drone campaign in Africa over the course of the last several years, but it was notable that we haven't seen this sort of targeting in at least 7 months. So this is really the first time that we're seeing that. And it's just a reminder that even though we're not talking about terrorism, we're making active efforts to go after terrorists on foreign soil. Al-Shabaab being one of the most violent organized branches of Al-Qaeda in Africa. Nearby in Yemen, we often talk about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That's where that branch of Al-Qaeda is based. And we pay close attention to that because there have been multiple attacks that have been launched from Yemen because of that particular group, launched in the United States, inspired by that group to be launched all over the world. And here's a way to kind of tie all these things together. Yemen is the site of the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, one of the worst humanitarian crises in the entire world. Afghanistan is high on that list now, post the US withdrawal and the Taliban taking over. And we're also looking at Ukraine as a growing humanitarian crisis. Here's how some of them are connected. So one of the reasons why there's a humanitarian crisis in Yemen is because of a famine. You have families starving. And what is one of the top imports into Yemen? 40% of the wheat imports into Yemen come from Russia and Ukraine. So this is a growing story. Another way that what happens in Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe can then affect Africa. Why do we pay attention to this? Because instability provides an opportunity or a window for terrorist groups to really gain strength. When your government isn't providing social services or food, but a terrorist group is, that can change the dynamic. And this is part of the way that terrorist groups get into a community and gain strength. Now, Yemen is a chaotic situation, also a site of a civil war that involves a lot of different proxy countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. The United States has been involved in the past. So there's a lot going on there, but it's something that we should definitely have, again, on our radar, because this has been a continuing humanitarian crisis and something that's really just devastating for the innocent people that do live there. Also, just want to mention this. When we're talking about threats around the world, one of the areas that we keep an eye on is North Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons. And just this week, the United States reported that North Korea was testing an ICBM system. It looked like they're testing out a new weapon, an intercontinental ballistic missile system, right? That's ICBM. And the reason why we pay attention to this sort of weapon is because the weapon can go, the rocket can go a very long distance, intercontinental. But you can also put nuclear warheads on this rocket. And so if you have an effective intercontinental ballistic missile, it can hit targets far away. And that's always the question, can North Korea hit the United States? The United States, by the way, pulled back on an ICBM test that we had planned. Countries can announce to the world, okay, we're going to be testing this weapon or we're going to be testing this system. The United States recently decided not to do that because they didn't want to appear provocative. You have North Korea testing these systems and a question about whether or not they're going to be capable of a further reach. And that's a really important thing to watch, because not only is North Korea an isolated country, it's also listed as a state sponsor of terror. The US State Department has designated a multitude of different countries state sponsors of terror, which means they invest and actively support terrorist groups around the world. North Korea is one of them. Cuba, Iran, and Syria are the others. And so that's a special designation that a lot of countries don't get, even if they're doing things that we don't agree with. And so we want to watch North Korea, not only for what they're capable of, But what information could they share with others? For example, what information could they share with Iran? We're watching Iran and its nuclear program. Iran says it's a peaceful nuclear program. The United States and others don't believe that. And so we're actively negotiating with Iran to try to change behavior. This is something that's a policy of the Biden administration, to get them to abandon trying to develop nuclear weapons that they deny being a part of. These negotiations have been ongoing, and we're watching them because as there's disruption in the oil market over the last several years, the oil that has been produced in Iran hasn't been able to get to all the markets it could potentially get to because of sanctions. And so the thinking is, well, is this why the United States is speaking more actively and aggressively to Iran on some sort of deal, speaking more aggressively to Venezuela, which has the largest petroleum reserves in the entire world? Is this why we're engaging with what we would consider adversaries to try to counter the disruption that we're seeing in Eastern Europe? So that's important. Back here at home, all of that, when we're looking at oil prices, gas prices, all of that can affect inflation. And I want to talk to you about that because once a month we get a couple different readings of inflation, but we get a once a month reading that gives us an idea about what inflation looks like in the country. And in general, inflation exists. So you're very, very rarely do you get a negative reading or a zero reading. In fact, we sort of expect inflation 1% to 2%. You expect a little growth of higher prices. Inflation becomes problematic when your price of goods is outpacing your currency. So when you think, oh, it's higher inflation, basically it means that your dollar is buying you less, and we don't want your dollar to buy you less. So that's why we're really watching inflation. And we're getting another reading that yet again is showing us that we're seeing the highest inflation that we've seen in decades. The really important thing to know about this is that data, one piece of data doesn't create a story. We're always watching multiple pieces of data because we're watching a trend. And the reality is that we have seen inflation on the rise actively really since the middle of last year. So although there's talk about how Russia and Ukraine can impact inflation, and it certainly will, a lot of things can impact inflation. Inflation and the inflationary environment was already here in the United States before the conflict. In fact, the data that we got, which is somehow sort of being linked to Russia and Ukraine, is looking back on the month of February. And we only had the war in Ukraine actively at the end of February. So it's not really accounting for all of that. So it predates this conflict. So regardless of how much the conflict is being talked about related to inflation, inflation was already here because of all sorts of reasons, including supply chain issues. And although both parties like to point fingers at each other and say they're responsible for inflation, the bottom line is lawmakers of all political parties have spent a lot of our money, pushed a lot of stimulus into the economy over the last several years. And when you do that, the risk of that is higher inflation on the horizon. And so it's not just what's happened in the last few weeks or just what's happened under the Biden administration or just what happened under the Trump administration. It is a continuum of a story. Speaking of Congress and money, they ended up passing a huge spending bill just over the last couple of days. They had the motivation of trying to get aid to Ukraine, but they also had this spending bill, which is basically our budget. What are we going to spend this year? They had been sort of kicking the can down the road, temporarily funding the government to avoid a government shutdown because both sides couldn't agree on what the spending bill should look like. So they finally did agree. And it looks like the government will be funded through the next several months to the end of the year. All right, this just kind of wrapping up here. One of the things that I've been really paying close attention to is what's happening when it comes to COVID and COVID policies, because that was our biggest story that we were covering constantly. And then suddenly, obviously, our attention was brought elsewhere for the right reasons. But I don't want to forget this. You still have the pandemic and pandemic policies across the country affecting us in different ways. And although we're seeing some of those policies being drawn back, vaccine mandates being drawn back, mask mandates, we're still also in a period where we're really learning a lot. Check this out. This is a pile of information. I printed out a bunch of different studies from the CDC because I just needed to catch up on all of them. So what I'm going to do is actually kind of dangerous. I'm going to generalize what my takeaways are from a lot of these different studies that are looking at Omicron and looking at the Pfizer vaccine. By the way, most of the studies coming from the CDC are focused on the Pfizer vaccine specifically. So just important to know. So here are my three big takeaways. Very broad strokes that the scientists among you it can be difficult, but I'm just going to generalize because I think it was important for me to step back and be like, what does any of this mean? Here's one of the things that I think came out from a lot of this research. We have heard in the past that there's a concern about waning immunity if you've been vaccinated about 6 months after your second dose. And the reality is that when you're looking at the data, that concern is continuing, that there's something about that 6-month mark period that is being highlighted as, is that when you're starting to see any immunity from the vaccine start to sort of fade? There's also a question about vaccine effectiveness against Omicron, but we're in this sort of interesting period where the data is still being worked through, whether or not the vaccine is waning or whether or not this variant is just different, or it's a combination of the two. And some of the data, because remember, the Omicron wave really hit end of November, December, January. It was really fast and super intense. And so the data is still being collected and organized, and we're going to see a lot more of it, I think, over the next couple of weeks and months. That's going to be better than some of the data that we have now, because if the research is being published now, that means they're only maybe including the month of December, for example. So there might be a limit to that. There is a concern when it comes to children, specifically New York State Health Department. We've talked a little bit about this, was looking about the vaccine effectiveness for kids, and was seeing a drop in efficacy, a fairly dramatic drop in efficacy warding infection, and a drop in efficacy warding off hospitalization. The concern here is focused on vaccine doses. Remember, kids 5 to 11 are receiving this smaller dose. And so the question is the dose not big enough, but would a larger dose actually elicit harmful or adverse reactions that would not be good? And so that's something that researchers are trying to figure out now. You will see doctors say, well, if it's a lower dose, perhaps more kids need to be vaccinated for it to be effective. You may see those talking about booster doses, even for the young. And I just want to add some context to this. Remember back at the beginning when we were still wondering if there would ever be a vaccine for a coronavirus, because there's never been a vaccine for a coronavirus in world history. Dr. Fauci said, if this was as effective as a flu vaccine, which we know the flu vaccine on a year-to-year basis is 50% effective, it provides something, but we don't really know how effective it is depending on the strain of the flu. He said that would be a win. And what happened is the early research showed great efficacy, 90% efficacy for Pfizer at the very beginning. So the question that I have based on this research is really watching the next several months, especially ahead of another flu season, with a question about whether or not we're going to see this vaccine recommended on a more regular basis. Does it become more like a flu vaccine? We've talked about that. Is the research really pointing in that direction? But also, how do you really figure out vaccine efficacy when you have a broad swath of the population that has been vaccinated and a broad swath of the population that has immunity from prior infection, maybe not one infection, but maybe 2 infections, and maybe crossover between that community of vaccinated people that have had prior infection? So how do you sift through all of that and really understand what we're going to need moving forward to make sure that we don't repeat what happened over the last 2 years? And that's a question that I really would like to talk to a doctor about. How at this point we knew how to test vaccine efficacy when you had a very naive population with few people with infection and a high rate of infection though in the community, a high rate of transmission. So you knew people were being exposed to the disease, the virus, and you could kind of figure out, did the people with the placebo get it more often or the people with the vaccine get it more often? And we don't, again, how do we sift through that? How do we figure it out? And I don't know the answer to that. So that's something I'm going to be paying close attention to. I'm also curious about where Novavax stands. Novavax is the vaccine that's not an mRNA vaccine like Pfizer and Moderna. So where does that stand? And how does that look in comparison once it once we believe it would be approved for emergency use authorization by the FDA. So I'm going to be watching these new vaccines. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of vaccines still in development. We're only really talking about a small amount, and most of our research is really focused on Pfizer, at least the research that I'm seeing. So, all right, that was quite a little trip. Thanks for coming with me. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful and privileged to be able to serve you during these historic times. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon on smartnews.com.